A quick search.
Pleased to meet you. Sorry for
Un, deux, trois, test, un, trois, test. Est-ce que tu m'entends, Ben?
Oui, oui, oui. Entendez-vous?
1,
You
2,
hear me?
3, test. Ben, est-ce que tu m'entends?
Yeah, I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Tu m'entends?
Hello? Oui, 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 c'est bon. Oui.
Ben, 1, 2, 3, test.
Yes, I hear you. Can you hear me?
Je suis pas sur la bonne oreillette. Ben, tu m'entends?
Oui.
Oui, ok, parfait, je t'entends. J'ai beaucoup de bruit autour de moi, donc c'est pas facile.
Oui, 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 exactement.
Est-ce que tu arrives à allumer ta caméra, s'il te plaît? Coupe le partage du monsieur. Ok,
Caméra,
c'est
ok.
bon? Ouais, c'est bon. Je te fais juste un partage, tu me dis si tu vois.
Ok.
Tu vois le PC, Ben?
Oui. Do you see?
Ok, parfait. C'est tout bon. Attends, chaque chose en son temps, madame. Deux petites secondes, on fait juste un test. Ok,
Yeah,
Ben,
it's
moi
okay.
c'est bon.
Yeah,
Je
yeah.
te vois, je t'entends, donc le WebEx il est validé.
Yeah, ok.
Ok, merci Ben.
Au revoir à toutes. Hey, yeah, yeah. C'est bon.
Let's see if this works. Okay, you hear me? Yeah, good.
Oh, really? Seriously?
All right.
You have to wait for the big star. There she is.
Yes.
There she is.
There we are. Great. Okay. Marcos is here.
So everything is Alex.
Yes. All right. Yes, please. Alex, join us, please. You'll be the... Hi, Jen. Sorry, but...
Are you okay? How are you doing?
Okay. I
It's
think
good, yeah, it's fine.
You want to have a name?
we don't have a name card this time, so yeah. Yeah.
You're anonymous.
Yeah.
You're anonymous.
Well, we will have a poster, a slide with everyone's name.
There's a song. I have a name.
So I suggest that we gradually get started due to time constraints, and I'd like just check with Diana and Harvey whether technically we can start. Excellent. So, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this next side event, a very important side event. It's organized between the University of Geneva, the Swiss Commission for UNESCO, colleagues at the High Commission of Human Rights, and the Geneva Environment Network. So we're very pleased to organize this event, and particularly pleased to be able to organize this in the context of the social forum. We've seen this morning already how important the discussion is, how diverse the discussion is, but also how polarized it easily gets. And that reminded us really of the importance of why we're here, to talk about enhancing the right to science and the planetary crisis. And I'm really pleased to say that we have a very important panel of speakers here that are particularly vocal and engaged in actually taking this discussion forward in a systematic and substantive manner. And I think it's important. Also Peter Larsen, I introduced myself, speaking from the University of Geneva and the Swiss Commission. And to my left, Marcos Orellana, Special Rapporteur on Toxics and Human Rights. And to the left of Marcos, Alessandra Santaki, Special Rapporteur on Cultural Rights. So also really benefiting from two Special Rapporteurs who have play a substantive role really in taking this agenda forward is excellent. To my right, Yvonne Donders from the University of Amsterdam, also longstanding researcher on the right to science. And to the far right, Kostas Tararas from UNESCO in Paris. So the hope today is really to try to give you all a sense of this field, a sense of a field that not only has been neglected for years, but actually now is exploding in terms of interest and relevance. And you might say, well, isn't it a bit ambitious to actually bring forward the right to science and speak to the planetary crisis? Well, we think not. And we think in many ways, if a couple of words of introduction by myself and later Kostas will show you a bit about how actually in substantive terms, this is really relevant. Let me give you a couple of snapshots. Last year, we organized a Geneva dialogue on the right to science with many of the people in the room present as well, involving academia, civil society, UN organizations, and others, basically coming out with 16 very practical key messages and key actions for actually raising the right to science as a key science and diplomacy matter. You'll see the mentioning here, the little red thing, and some of you might also have seen the report being distributed, a number of key findings, a number of key actions where people actually get together and say, we have substance to talk about. We'll also hear more about later a recent effort to also have a special issue supported by Frontiers journals, specifically looking at enhancing the right to science with 7 important articles already, and more opinions pieces coming, and Yvonne Donders here also as one of the speakers in this matter. Very quickly, let me give you one example of a key message and key action that came out in that report. One was simply that people really acknowledged that the right to science is fundamental in responding at this time of the year in the COVID-19 pandemics, but also the triple planetary crisis at the time, no? So we're talking about if we really want to solve these issues, address these issues, the right to science is central. And that actually requires substantive work in terms of building this right to science as a building block and engaging with the different actors in that respect. So what we called for there was actually moving from fragmentation to more comprehensive engagements. A tendency we see sometimes of the right to science to sort of be narrowed down to meaning a few things where it actually covers a bundle of different rights dimensions and issues and the importance of taking a comprehensive approach. Yet, at the same time, the meeting acknowledged a distinctive absence of a discussion around these topics in international policy arenas very often, in international human rights processes, as a systematic underreporting, which was kind of surprising to many of us, actually. And we really actually had to double check it again and again and say, why is it so absent? Issues like academic freedom, issues like science being curtailed, issues like public science minimized compared to privatized science, something that you, Marcos Oriana, have also stressed a lot. These dynamics are fundamental, affecting current science policy engagements, yet are not really raised. So there's a disconnect. And we thought that there's a real systematic lack of a common narrative and these disconnects between actors working on this. And I also speak on my own behalf of academia that we actually haven't been strong enough to engage on these topics and speak out as a collective voice. So this is also work in progress for all of us. I will also give you, basically stop here, but there are more findings to look into. Really, the question we want to talk about today is where do we go from here? What are key trends and opportunities? But before we listen to our panelists, I'd like to pass the word on to Kostas from UNESCO also to give a bit of further context on this. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Peter, for this opening, reminding us what we have went through, where we've gone through the steps until now, and what we are faced with going forward. And also thanks to all the partners who have made this event possible and the conversation with you. Three key points I would like to highlight. The first point is that there is, I think, common knowledge and acceptance among all players, including member states, that the world needs more science, but not just any science. We need science ecosystems that are shaped by human rights, equality, justice, inclusion, and the scientific ecosystem should not be driven exclusively or fundamentally by growth and productivity considerations. And indeed, the triple planetary crisis that you were mentioning, Peter, is just a reminder, is an illustration of how deeply we need this change of direction. The second point I would like to stress, and it came out also, I think, in a number of presentations, particularly in the high-level panel of this morning, is the importance of the right to science as a powerful leverage to help produce the change I'm talking about. And indeed, today we're better placed than we have been a few years back in terms of using the right to science. If I'm talking on the side of UNESCO, during the last 5-6 years, there have been several standard-setting instruments that have been adopted that focus on the area of science and endorse a human rights approach to science and scientific researchers. There was a recommendation in 2017, artificial intelligence and the digital world, and we heard a lot of delegations and speakers this morning highlight the importance of linking human rights, ethics to AI development, open science, and so on. There's also a better political climate, I would say, as regards science and the connection with human rights. Obviously, today's social forum is a proof that member states are looking at the connection more systematically. But we also had a statement in March this year at the Human Rights Council by more than 17 countries putting the focus on academic freedom. And of course, you have increasing work by international organizations. At UNESCO, we have had a recent decision by member states putting emphasis on really upscaling efforts to implement our recommendation of 2017 on science and scientific researchers. And hopefully in the coming 2 weeks at the General Conference of the organization, we will have additional momentum to focus on one of the key issues of this recommendation, which is the freedom of scientific research and the safety of scientists. So the third point, and I would like to close with that, is to leverage the right to science more effectively, we need to connect the dots. Peter was speaking before about fragmentation, the fact that there are efforts, but that they're not well connected. And indeed, this is something that we need to make sure it changes radically in the future. The examples that you mentioned, the Geneva dialogue, the opinion pieces that we're publishing with the help of Frontiers are some illustrations of how to connect international organizations, academia, experts in terms of highlighting and elucidating the content of the right to science. But there's many more. And as I was saying, from the side of UNESCO, we would really hope that we can count on the participation and the contribution of different stakeholders and constituencies in the work that we do to promote open science, ethics of AI, and particularly this new initiative that we are in the process of launching on freedom of scientific research and the safety of scientists. So having said that, I would like to thank again also our speakers who would really bring, and you will hear it, valuable insights to the topic, the issues, the progress made so far, but also the challenges ahead. And perhaps close with a message of hope, aspiration, if I can say. This year, let's not forget it, is a double commemoration, is a double anniversary, Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the Vienna Declaration. And there's still a lot to be done in terms of implementing the principle of indivisibility. So perhaps with what is happening here at the Social Forum, with events, we may be able to use this as a turning point to make sure that the right to science finds its equal place together with other human rights. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kostas, and indeed also showing how this is a strong collective effort. And I would also say that I didn't introduce before a panelist we have online, Stefan Kuster from Frontiers, an ally also in really pushing this agenda on the right to science. So with those words, I think we've sort of set the scene. You see, we have a huge agenda in front of us, a huge potential as well. And I'm really thrilled that we have Alessandra Santacchi here, a special rapporteur on the rights, on cultural rights, who specifically in your next report also will be addressing the right to science. So please, what do you see the main issues, trends, and if in 5 minutes?
So plenty of time. So I'm going to focus on, kind of specific aspects for the way forward. So the first issue is, I don't know if you were in the room or if you followed the discussion this morning, there were very few people that talked, very few interventions that talked about science as a human right. And I think that we really have to, insist on this issue. So, science is not a driver for the respect of other human rights. Science is a very well established human right, and we have to take it as this. And you're going to say to me, oh, are you saying this because you're in the UN, because it is part of your mandate? No, I'm saying this because if we keep talking about science as a driver rather than as a human right, then we do not link it to rights of non-discrimination. We do not see, we don't link it with rights of participation, and we don't focus on what the individual, takes out of it. So, we go to the protection of science in general the WIPO through patents may protect science, but does not protect the individual that actually, the inventor, and even more so, the individual that should have access to the products of scientific knowledge. So I think it is extremely important to kind of rein back the debate and continue to talk about the right to science. And I'm so happy that UNESCO is a very strong ally in this respect. The second issue, since I only have 5 minutes, is about collaboration and discussion. WIPO at the moment is becoming and is a major player, and kind of everybody has their own foci and their own mandates. But there seems to be some discussion, even if we disagree, and some discussion not only on why we're all fantastic in what we're doing, but what are the weaknesses and what are the challenges. And at the moment, unfortunately, this discussion does not exist. I am delighted that UNESCO and my mandate have managed to, have a discussion on various issues and this dialogue to continue. And yes, we agree and yes, we disagree, but at least we sit on the table and we explain to people where we're coming from. And I wish I could see that more with respect to the WTO, WIPO and other organizations. And also, this also can lead to the human rights monitoring bodies. And I'm very happy that Yvonne is now in the Human Rights Committee, and I know that we've talked about dialogue. I have been talking not about the right to science, but about other aspects to other monitoring bodies. But only then are we all going to have a consistent message that states that is clear and states can follow and implement within their domestic level. And the third issue is, I think it is very important to resist to existing narratives that are false narratives. And we can only resist to these narratives that seem to happen if, first of all, we resist that spaces where the civil society has a role to play get shrunk so that states do not allow civil society to talk about their experiences in the right to science and putting forward procedural reasons and this, I don't know, the state system authority in the international organizations bodies, so that we do not allow people to talk to us about their experiences. So this is the first way of stopping the narrative. I was very surprised that in the room there was no state out of the states that are so eager to talk about freedom of speech that did not say that everyone has the right to talk about their experiences, even if their speech is provocative and goes against the state. The second issue is that we should resist the lack of participation at all levels, and I think that I've changed my tune in this respect. I do believe that participation can take different aspects, but everyone, according to international law, according to standards that the states have agreed that they're going to respect, has the right to participation to science. Yet we see that this right is not implemented. So, and we also see that policies on these issues get adopted in the name of science, but in the name of a very elitist, very exclusive, and very restrictive understanding of what science is and who are the people that have a say and have a voice. So, for example, indigenous voices, citizen science, and other types of collectivities and individuals, and even, the type of scientists that are being asked to contribute, these shapes how the states justify their political decisions in the name of science. And finally, this is also a call for inclusivity. We still have a lot of issues when it comes to access to the right to science, the right to access to science, but we have to focus on that as well. There is still a lot of divide. We focus a little bit on North and South, but we have to focus also on the intersections within states. So women who are poor, minority women, etc. And we still have to discuss the gaps that poverty and other current challenges and current crises make even bigger, which has a very clear impact on the right to science. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alessandra. Indeed, insisting upon this issue of inclusivity, diversity, and addressing gaps, whether we're talking north-south, intrastate, across different groups, etc. An important contribution. Thank you so much. And that actually connects me very well also to Yvonne Donders, who was one of the authors of this special issue of the Frontiers publication that we mentioned earlier. We encourage you all to have a look at the Enhancing Right to Science. There will be a policy lab also around this that you will be able to follow the conversation, which is really the idea of saying we need to open up. We need to broaden this conversation. And in terms of inclusivity, I would say that speaks very well to what you might want to say, I imagine. Thank you, Yvonne, for being here.
Thank you very much, Peter, Kostas, organizers, for allowing me to speak indeed on a topic which is unfortunately not a trend, because it's a very persistent problem in relation to science, and that is gender inequality. So the right to science was included in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights 75 years ago. And although a very influential person in the drafting of the Universal Declaration was a woman, Eleanor Roosevelt, the position of women in the Universal Declaration is still rather weak. And despite the fact that equality and non-discrimination are at the heart of the Universal Declaration, women still do not enjoy human rights equally with men. And this is also very true for the right to science. Now, all forms of discrimination, direct, indirect, structural, cause or sustain the disadvantaged position of women in sciences and research. Examples of direct discrimination are laws and policies that prohibit women from accessing or participating in education and sciences. The recent measures taken by the Taliban regime in Afghanistan, where girls and women were officially expelled from university and banned from schools, is a striking and sad example. Indirect discrimination occurs when rules and procedures are seemingly neutral, but in practice have a specific disadvantage for women. For instance, there can be certain requirements for promotion for leadership positions that apply to all, but that are more difficult to meet for women. For instance, the requirement that a substantive part of the scientific education and experience has to be acquired abroad, which may be difficult for women for whom an extensive stay abroad cannot be combined with caretaking tasks. Structural discrimination is reflected in systemic, but often very subtle mechanisms or professional practices that discourage women's participation. Prejudices and stereotypes, but also ignorance, are often at the basis of these practices. For instance, competitions for research grants and publications in peer-reviewed journals are not always gender neutral. Another well-known challenge is that a successful career in sciences is only possible if one devotes large amounts of time to doing research. And this may be difficult or impossible for women in periods of their life that are also crucial for founding a family. For men, it may be easier to postpone becoming a parent. What does the right to science then have to offer? The right to science covers access, participation, contribution, enjoying the benefits, as well as protection against harmful science. And all these have gender dimensions that seem to sustain inequalities between women and men in relation to sciences and research. The general comments on science in economic, social, and cultural rights adopted by the Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights includes various measures to tackle these gender dimensions. For instance, states should immediately eliminate barriers that affect girls' and women's access to quality scientific education and careers. Even more, the elimination of all laws, policies, practices, prejudices, or stereotypes that undermine women and girls' participation in science is a so-called core obligation. Important here is also the obligation to raise public awareness in order to eliminate stereotype that excludes women from sciences. Temporary special measures, such as quotas for women participation, may be necessary in order to advance more quickly towards substantive equality in the enjoyment of the right to science. The UNESCO recommendation, as was referred to, on science and scientific researchers also addresses these issues. States should, for instance, according to this recommendation, actively encourage women to consider careers in sciences and endeavor to eliminate biases against women in work environments and appraisal. It is recommended that performance evaluations are gender sensitive, taking due account of the need to appraise all aspects of the individual's performance in context and account for family care-related interruptions of employment so that the careers and research of those who take family-related leave are not negatively impacted as a result. In short, the right to science, in combination with the general prohibition of all forms of discrimination, clearly implies that women have the right to equally access, participate in, and contribute to sciences and research, and that states have positive obligations to ensure this right. The international legal instruments on the right to science demonstrate a large degree of consensus among states on the need, at least in theory, to promote gender equality in sciences and research. Practice is, however, very, very different, and inequality seemingly ineradicable. Concrete and effective action is urgently needed, including removing barriers and making science policies more gender-based. The right to science exists for 75 years now. It's time to start using it as a normative tool to repair and prevent gender inequalities in sciences and research. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you indeed for a very strong opinion piece, but more than that, also demonstrating the very practical and concrete ways of translating this right to science into a major global issue, a major global development priority as well. And in that spirit, I also want to get back to a broader dimension of the planetary crisis. We often speak of the planetary crisis. We're going to have a discussion about this in plenary in half an hour. And one of the leading voices, an eye-opener voice for me in also looking at the implications for this, in one of the elements of this, was really a report that you wrote, Marcos Orellana, as part of your mandate on toxics and human rights, and really insisting upon making the link to right to science in one of your reports. So thank you for having done that. I think it paved the way for a number of efforts that we now see are also taking off at the global level. And perhaps you might, please, you have 5 minutes to perhaps share what you see as specifics. I don't know if you want to leave it to a specifics around the, some of the discussions in the chemical field, perhaps, or take it broader. The floor is yours in any case.
Thank you very much, Peter, and thank you also to the organizers of this conversation for the opportunity to be here. I'm really pleased to have that chance. I want to first echo something that you said, Peter, at the very beginning.
I think it's on.
It's on.
That the right to science has been neglected for a number of decades. As we've heard, also other speakers mentioned, the right to science is an integral element of the catalog of internationally protected human rights. It finds expression in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, also in the International Covenant on Economic, Social, Cultural Rights. And as you mentioned, Peter, in 2021, I had the opportunity to present to the Human Rights Council a report that looks at the implications of the right to science in the toxics context. A couple distillations of that report in terms of normative content, the need to secure availability and accessibility of scientific information. Often scientific information is neither accessible nor available. And then perhaps crucially, the requirement for alignment between regulatory measures and the best available scientific evidence. There's a wide distance between scientific evidence and what we do about it, what we know and what we do about it. And that distance is not an accident. It is the result of deliberate obfuscation and manipulation of science and scientific evidence by economic interests. There are certain firms that specialize in spreading doubt, in spreading confusion, because confusion means delay, it means inaction, it means lack of protections. Where there's lack of protections, then the result is exposure. Exposure of people, exposure of countless individuals and groups around the world to hazardous substances. I could elaborate on a number of examples, but since time is short, I will only mention that this compromises the enjoyment of several international rights, such as the right to life, the right to health, and the right to a healthy environment. Disinformation is big business, but it's also a result, the gap, this chasm between what we know and what we do about it is also the result of attacks against scientists. We see this in universities where scientists that publish works that may offend certain economic interests may be blacklisted and then are harassed. They're denied promotions. There are so-called SLAPs, so strategic litigation against public participation. They're persecuted. And certainly then also there's conflict of interests that may undermine the transferring of science into policy making. I'll come back to that in a minute. all of this is to say that in order for the benefits of science or the production of scientific knowledge to benefit society, there needs to be a process of translation. These benefits do not occur automatically, as it were. That process of translation means the application of the knowledge in the design of actual policies so that people, society, may be protected against risks and harms of chemicals and wastes. A couple examples: international legal instruments on chemicals. You may be familiar with the Rotterdam Convention on international trade in certain industrialized chemicals and pesticides. The failure of the science policy interface of this convention, which is quite a narrow convention. It's basically about the right to know. I won't get into the details, but the breakdown has meant that this convention has become ineffectual. An example at the national level, I had the opportunity to conduct a country visit to Paraguay. There's a body in the scientific system there that in the hands of the government that decides on the funding for academic, scientific and research projects. There were certain studies carried out by certain scientists that showed impacts on children that had been exposed to pesticides, hazardous pesticides, impacts on their DNA. After that, industry representatives were seated in this body that approves the funding. After that, no more funding for scientific research on the impacts of pesticides on children. Now, as you were asking, Peter, what's coming up, we see that the last session of the UN Environment Assembly has kicked off negotiations to set up a global platform on the science policy interface on chemicals, waste, and pollution. There are big questions of potential corporate capture, big questions about conflict of interest. So I'm out of time. In closing, I only again wish to echo what Kostas Tararas has mentioned, which is we are indeed here with the right to science and a message of hope. As we celebrate the 75th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights this year, it's a moment for renewed commitment for human rights so that they can actually guide us in confronting the existential crisis that humanity is facing. And the right to science is a key element of that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Marcos, for zooming in on the specifics, but also zooming out and showing the bigger context. And I think indeed, also for me, it's been such a discovery to see that people engaged in the right to science community actually offering us the building blocks for something that can work better. We can address these gaps of the vulnerability of scientists and researchers. We can address the gaps in terms of gender inclusivity and so on through these measures. We have the instruments. We have a real normative convergence, even in terms of the triple planetary crisis as well, in terms of environmental issues and the right to a clean, healthy environment and so on. So it's now up to us to put it into practice. And in that sense, one key issue actually also concerns how we engage with science, publications, and so on. And it's a real privilege also to have Stefan Kuster from Frontiers to speak to us at a distance, but to show us, to give us a few insights and share some insights also in terms of the agenda looking forward on some of these issues. Stefan, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much and good afternoon. I hope you can hear me and I see my slides, so I assume you're also seeing my slides. Thank you, Peter. Thank you, Kostas. And
grab your earphones.
Can you hear me? Am I audible? I cannot see you.
Okay.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I hear you now.
Okay, thanks. So sorry about that glitch. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Peter and Kostas, for letting me speak to you for a few minutes today from Zurich. And I am sorry for not being able to join you in Geneva. And thank you both also for calling Frontiers an ally in the effort to advance the right to science, because we certainly are. Frontiers is a fully open access publisher, and we were founded with the mission to make science openly accessible, because we believe that when the science is shared openly, many of its benefits are amplified and accelerated, such as more equitable participation, faster innovation, and fairer outcomes. And this is not only a naive vision that we have evidence for this. And one of the latest, clearest illustrations of this was the COVID pandemic, and how sharing the science and making it openly available, the data as well as published peer-reviewed results, accelerated the development of treatments and vaccines. And we cannot afford to have the science behind climate change, for example, not openly available if we want to avoid climate disaster, planetary crisis. So we also see this clearly as part of a human right to participate in and enjoy in the benefits of science. I'll briefly mention 3 of our initiatives that support research and discussion on the right to science topic and its links to solving planetary crisis. We do this in 3 ways. Next slide, please. Yeah, this one, perfect. As Peter already mentioned, the first thing is a special collection of peer-reviewed scholarly articles that we have launched together with Peter and Kostas on this topic. And obviously, like all the other scientific content published, this is open access from the moment it's published, accessible for free to anyone. This collection, as far as we know, is the only scholarly editorial outlet dedicated exclusively to bringing together in one place the state of the art in scholarly thought and research about the topic of enhancing the right to science. Next slide, please. We are incredibly excited about the articles that have already gone through peer review and have been accepted. And there are several more that are in that process. Several of the authors of the first batch of articles are, I believe, participating in the broader event today and may even be in the room. I don't see the the audience, but we're incredibly excited about this. Next slide, please. The next initiative, which Peter also briefly alluded to, is the Policy Labs, which is a platform that we host as Frontiers, where we focus on connecting the scholarly research that we publish in our scientific journals and connecting that with policy making and decision making through various formats such as opinion pieces, podcasts, panel discussions, and others. And in the field of the right of science, there is a clear need to enhance that connection between research and practice. And this has been alluded to by the previous speakers. And a few months ago, we were very privileged to be able to publish a piece by human rights lawyers and scholars Monica Plotza and Rafaela Kunz on the link between open science and a human right to science. And as Peter announced earlier, we will shortly launch a piece describing the policy implications of some of the latest research that is being published in the special collection on the right of science. Next slide, please. And finally, I would like to mention our latest initiative, the Open Science Charter, which the Frontiers Research Foundation is going to launch at the COP28 meeting in Dubai next month. And this is a charter signed by scientists and by institutions in the scientific community, as well as global organizations, calling on the leaders that are meeting at COP for more open science based on a human right to science. We are, with this, bringing the right to science to the big stage and also offering something to these global leaders that come together at the COP meetings very often with a very good intentions, but fail at making grand commitments. Here is something that they can do that has a tangible impact on the climate crisis, but also on more equitable and wider access to science by mandating that the science that they fund with their public means is becomes openly available. This charter will also be open for support and signing by a broader community. We will initiate a petition for this. So all of you will be invited also to add your name as signatories to the charter shortly. Thank you. And with this, I would end my short presentation. I hope I stayed within the 5 minutes, Peter.
Thank you so much, Stefan, and indeed showing the multiple points of possibilities of action from wherever you are, and congratulations with that work. We now have roughly 10 minutes left, and I'd like to basically open the floor also for questions and comments. Marisa, yes, please. And then if you could introduce yourself also, please, that would be most useful. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. I'm Marisela Munoz with GESDA, the Geneva Science and Diplomacy Anticipator. Thank you so much for the excellent insights. We have heard that the human right to science is already included in Article 27 of the Human Rights Declaration, the Covenant for Political, Social, and Cultural Rights. So it does exist. And I gather that the question is about reactivating, revitalizing this right. So taking advantage of the wealth of knowledge at the table, could you perhaps share some specific concrete recommendations on how we can operationalize this right? Because as a former diplomat, I would think that the UPR mechanism is one way. You know, we could hold countries accountable during that exercise. But as a global multi-stakeholder community, are there suggestions there of how we can all engage more actively, both from the scientific community as inventors, as you mentioned, but also as users, so that we all know that we need to protect this right and to make sure that this right empowers other rights? Thank you.
Thank you very much for that question. Also from a science diplomacy perspective, I think it's a really concrete and practical one. Would anyone like to jump in? I would briefly say that I think what I have experienced is the need for clearly a collective effort and a tendency actually to the progress being made right now is highly uneven. We see certain fields happening in certain things happening in certain fields, but not in others. So this really, I mean, using the UPR not just as a method of keeping an eye on what's happening and what states are doing, but also of learning together actually through that process, I think is now critical. And I think as it has not come naturally in its long existence, there is a need for, let's say, a proactive effort to do the things like Alessandra also called for in her presentation in plenary, to really adopt a rights-based approach to science and really acknowledge that we're not going to achieve these contributions of science to our wider development agendas, to solving the planetary crisis, unless we actually sufficiently and adequately put in place the foundations for a right to science that's protected effectively. I mean, it's a key enabler. And as we do that, we will end up in the situations like you're insisting upon, Marcos, that you're showing, where scientists are ruled out of the room, they're not promoted, their knowledge is discredited, et cetera, et cetera. So we're back we're even not only back to zero, we're sort of going into negative somehow. I don't know if someone would like to add. Alessandra.
There should be a plethora and multiplicity of, actors and discussions. UPR would be fantastic. Specific committees would be great. But then what I want to focus on is that I think that the right to everyone that is in the right to science need to be understood. And I think that there is a tendency, in the same way that states focus a lot on the cultural sector rather than the right of everyone, having cultural rights, in the same way to focus on the scientists having the right to science rather than the every person, which is exactly what Marcos was saying about the every person having the tools to understand and take part in this exchange about, what science says at every stage. So I think that having an active civil society is very important. And I think that at the moment we do not see that in this respect. And I'm very glad that gradually, with the current participants' work, we see that the issue is getting better visibility and maybe civil society is getting more active in this respect.
Thank you. Yes, I would echo your call to revitalization of the right. The report I mentioned that I presented a couple of years ago has a number of recommendations, but I want to focus on one point, which is the issue of remedies for misinformation or disinformation. If we look at securities laws around the world, we'll see that if a company presents information that misleads investors, this can be prosecuted either civilly or in other ways. But if a company presents information that misinforms the scientific understandings on chemicals or otherwise, in the regulatory approaches that can then affect countless individuals, as I mentioned earlier, there's no penalty for that. And so there's an imbalance, there are gaps. And so in revitalizing the right to science, the strengthening of the integrity of regulatory processes in order to effect adequate environmental and health protections is one of the keys.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. It's always the million-dollar questions. How do you translate these wonderful principles and these things in international instruments really down to the very lowest level, namely in societies where people live? And I think it's a challenge to bring those indeed to the most local levels that we have. Because in the end, let's face it, we can here in Geneva, New York, or all these wonderful UN places do a lot of things. And I think that is important. And we have the special rapporteurs, we have treaty bodies, all of this is very crucial. But there's not, I think, a lot of people, if we all go home, to say, have you ever heard of this right to science? And do you know what that might entail for you? Because that would also, if we try to make that more known to much more people, and indeed, not only the scientists themselves or the people in certain areas, but really people, well, every day, everyone, then I think indeed it will come also bottom up what is actually needed to be able to enjoy those rights. Because again, I can imagine quite a few things, but maybe there's other groups in society that say, no, this is actually how we would like to, work with the right to science, and this is how we would interpret it. So it has to be, in my view, an interaction between the international, the regional, national, local, and again, going up and down. Because the importance of the right to science and why it was, I guess, included in these wonderful instruments such as the Universal Declaration is the importance, what we heard today as well, of science for society. And not only for a scientific endeavor, but really science for society. Thank you.
Thank you, Yvonne. And we have room for one more short question, and then we'll have to actually move on because a couple of us also have to step into the plenary. So last question from you, please. A short one, please. Thank you.
As short as I can, Boris Engelson, a journalist accredited with the UN. I was intrigued by the exotic case of Paraguay, because last year I attended a workshop at the University of Geneva where after a survey they found out that clinical studies by a private sector corporation were more objective than those by universities. Last month I have been attending another workshop where they reminded that the editor-in-chief of Lancet and Science concluded years ago that more than 50% of medical research, academic one, is wrong. When you go to social science meetings, you are struck for the past 50 years of trends, fashions. If you don't quote Bourdieu and Piketty every second sentence, you are out. And there was a time when they said better be wrong with Jean-Paul Sartre than right with Raymond Aron. When you attend accidentally meetings between the peers, they just speak of funding, of intrigues, of nomination, and usually they cannot even remember what is the topic for research. So my question, I am so sorry to be so blunt, has UNESCO reached the minimal floor of intellectual honesty to get involved into such serious issues?
Thank you for that question. And that actually leads me then to pass on the word now to Kostas from UNESCO, and also to wrap up the meeting for today in a couple of minutes. And yeah. And perhaps describe some of the ongoing initiatives actually that are quite significant in this field.
I think that was perfectly orchestrated, right? A brief point in reaction to your point, your comment before closing the meeting. I think rather than making empty statements, it would make sense to look at what has happened over the last few years in terms of setting standards and promoting initiatives that try to address many of the very valid points that were raised by the special rapporteurs, the speaker online, and yourself. And so in that sense, it would be worthwhile repeating that since 2017, we have a recommendation that talks about science and scientific researchers. and which actually highlights several issues. I think quite important in this context is the connection of the science endeavor with universal values and the ideals of the UN, the science policy interface, which was a point that was underscored by Marcos Orellana, the science society connection, and so on. Open science that my colleague Lydia Brito was talking about earlier in the room, with a number of initiatives that are precisely meant to translate the broad principles into concrete steps for basically promoting open science. We haven't spoken about that, but there's a lot of work that is currently going on the ethics of artificial intelligence. There was, I'm sure you know it, there was a recommendation that was adopted by UNESCO in 2021, and we're currently doing a readiness assessment test based on the recommendation in more than 35 countries across regions. So all that to say, yes, we have not answered all the problems that exist, but I think in all honesty, if we look at what has happened during the last 5-6 years, we have made quite significant progress. Now, if I will not do justice to all the very valid points that were made, just a few highlights. Actually, there are a lot of issues and problems that our world is facing that are very much connected to elements of the right to science. You were talking, Alexandra, about false narratives, inclusion. Yvonne put a zoom on gender-based discrimination and gender-related inequalities, the availability and access of scientific information, the issue of aligning policy with scientific evidence and the science policy interface. And if we look at the way the right to science is articulated in international instruments and the way it has been interpreted, you realize that it could very well be a leverage in terms of improving responses, strengthening policies, and the measures that are being implemented. And so in that sense, what we really need to do is address a gap that was really highlighted by all speakers, which is the fact that the right to science, despite 75 years of implementation of the Universal Declaration, remains underutilized. And in that sense, if you allow me, I will close with a double invitation. The first one is to use it. I mean, a number of speakers have done it in the morning. We're doing it heavily here. Please use the right to science in your constituencies, through your networks, because this will be a first step to make sure that it gets out of the closet, is really becoming a tool that we're using in our everyday life. And then I will close with something that was mentioned by Alexander and others, which is the fact that we need to do it together. I mean, 75 years have shown us that doing it on our own, UNESCO by itself, or academia by itself, or ETHR by itself, it doesn't work. We need to connect the dots. And there's a lot of work to be done. I mean, there are a lot of issues and areas within the right to science that need unpacking, where we talked about patents, intellectual property, linking science to policy making. So there's a lot to be done. Let's join efforts in that respect. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Kostas, and I'd like to really also invite you all to give a hand to these fantastic panelists. And thank you also to you as an audience. You will see that the next segment of the plenary is also dedicated to, indeed, the triple planetary crisis, if I recall correctly. So there will be lots of connections to be made there. I would also like to thank the Geneva Environment Network team in particular for allowing this to technically work out so well and also being shared more widely through YouTube. Excellent. Thank you, everyone, and wish you a nice afternoon. Thank you.